I never imagined a quiet Tuesday morning could turn into the kind of story people accuse you of exaggerating. One moment, I was standing at the end of my own driveway, unloading equipment from my truck, thinking about an upcoming briefing. The next, a woman I'd never met was screaming into her phone, pointing at me like I'd committed a felony. She kept shouting that I was blocking her access, trespassing, and about to regret this. That was when she said the words that changed everything: "I'm calling the police." I stayed calm, mostly because experience had taught me panic never helps. Our neighborhood sat right outside the perimeter of the military base I commanded, a place where rules, access points, and boundaries were clearly defined. My driveway curved along the property line, wide enough for 2 vehicles, and I'd parked exactly where I always did. Still, the woman paced back and forth, glaring at me as if she'd caught a criminal in the act. Neighbors began peeking through windows, sensing drama. She told the dispatcher I was an aggressive man blocking a public drive, refusing to move, and acting suspicious. I almost laughed at that last word. Suspicious was a label I'd spent my career applying to others, not wearing myself. I tried to explain calmly that it was my property, but she cut me off every time, insisting she knew her rights. Her confidence was absolute, fueled by the belief that authority would arrive and immediately side with her. Within minutes, a patrol car rolled in, lights flashing softly. The officer stepped out, professional but cautious, eyes moving between us. The woman launched into her story, voice shaking with triumph. She gestured wildly, demanding I be removed. I handed the officer my ID without a word, watching his expression shift as he read it. His posture straightened. His tone changed. That was the moment the woman noticed something was wrong. Her smug smile faded as the officer addressed me formally, using my rank. The air went dead silent. Confusion crossed her face, then fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She had called the cops on the base commander, and reality was finally catching up. And in that silence, I realized how fast power can flip when assumptions collapse. Moments earlier, she felt untouchable, shielded by confidence and outrage. Now she stood frozen, replaying every accusation in her head. The officer glanced at her, then back at me, waiting. I knew this wasn't just about a driveway anymore, it was about consequences, truth, and what happens next. For everyone watching, this confrontation was about to take an unexpected, irreversible turn right now today. The officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and asked the woman to step aside so he could ask a few questions. Her earlier fire was gone, replaced by stiff movements and darting eyes. She nodded too quickly, clutching her phone like a lifeline. I could almost see the realization settling in: this wasn't going the way she'd imagined during that call. Around us, neighbors lingered openly now, curiosity overpowering discretion. The officer asked her to explain, slowly, why she believed the driveway was public property. She stumbled through half-remembered HOA rules and something she'd heard from a friend. Each sentence contradicted the last. When the officer asked if she had documentation, her shoulders sank. She didn't. Meanwhile, I explained calmly that the driveway had been surveyed years earlier, approved by the base, and tied directly to my residence due to my position. I wasn't defensive. I didn't need to be. Facts have weight when emotions burn out. The officer nodded, clearly familiar with the area. He confirmed over his radio what he already knew, then turned back to her. He explained that not only was I within my rights, but that her report had included claims that could be considered false. That word false hit her harder than anything else. She tried to backpedal, insisting she'd just been concerned. Her voice cracked. At that point, I could have pushed for consequences immediately. Years of command had taught me when to press and when to pause. I asked the officer for a moment and addressed her directly. I told her I understood misunderstandings happen, but accusations carry weight, especially when they involve law enforcement. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her earlier certainty had dissolved into embarrassment and fear. The officer asked if I wished to file a formal complaint. The woman visibly flinched. Neighbors murmured. This was the pivot point, the moment where the situation could become a lesson or a punishment. I considered what example mattered most, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Authority isn't about crushing someone when you can. It's about choosing restraint without surrendering truth. I declined to press charges, but I didn't let it end there. I requested the officer formally document the incident and issue a warning about misuse of emergency services. He agreed. As he explained this to her, tears welled up in her eyes. She nodded repeatedly, whispering apologies that came far too late to erase what she'd done. When the officer left, the street felt different. The woman walked away quickly, avoiding every gaze. Neighbors slowly dispersed, buzzing with quiet conversations. I stood there alone again, the driveway suddenly just a driveway once more. But the air still carried tension, the kind that lingers after power shifts hands. I knew this story wouldn't end there. Consequences rarely do. Sometimes they unfold slowly, through reputation, reflection, and regret. And I had a feeling this incident was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would ripple far beyond a single phone. By the next morning, the neighborhood felt quieter, but not calmer. Word had spread fast, faster than I expected. People nodded differently when they saw me, some with curiosity, others with a new kind of respect that made me uncomfortable. I hadn't wanted attention, yet the incident had pulled back a curtain. Authority, once revealed, changes how people behave, even when you wish it wouldn't. Later that day, I received a call from the Homeowners Association. The woman from the driveway incident sat on their board. That explained the confidence, the certainty that she could dictate space and rules without question. The caller's tone was polite, rehearsed, and careful. They wanted to clarify boundaries and smooth things over. I agreed to attend their emergency meeting that evening, knowing exactly what that really meant. The meeting room was packed. Faces turned when I entered, conversations stopping mid-sentence. The woman sat stiffly at the table, eyes fixed on her papers. The HOA president cleared his throat and began explaining concerns about driveways, access, and complaints. I listened without interrupting, letting them talk themselves into a corner. When it was my turn, I stood and placed copies of the official land survey on the table. I explained, calmly and without raising my voice, where the property lines were, why they were drawn that way, and how they had been approved years earlier. I also explained the legal implications of harassment, false reports, and targeting residents without cause. No threats. Just facts. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Several board members exchanged looks. They hadn't expected preparation. They had expected compliance. When I finished, the HOA president asked if I intended to escalate the matter. I said no, but I made one thing clear: there would be no further interference, no more warnings disguised as authority. If there was another incident, it wouldn't end with a conversation. The woman finally looked up then, her face pale. This wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. It was about accountability. The board voted, quietly and quickly, to issue a formal apology and amend their internal guidelines. The woman resigned her position that night. She left without speaking to anyone, shoulders hunched, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. I didn't feel victory. I felt resolve. Situations like this aren't about winning, they're about restoring balance. As I walked home, the street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. My driveway sat exactly where it always had, unchanged, unquestioned now. I realized something important in that moment. People often misuse power because they assume no one will challenge them. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's backed by calm certainty and patience. Still, I sensed the story wasn't finished. Consequences don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they echo, quietly, reminding everyone involved that actions leave marks long after the shouting stops and the patrol cars drive away. Weeks passed, and life settled back into routine, but the lesson from that morning never left me. The driveway incident became a quiet reference point in my own thinking, a reminder of how easily authority can be mistaken, borrowed, or abused. I returned to base duties, briefings, inspections, and decisions that carried far greater consequences than a neighborhood dispute, yet the memory stayed vivid. Occasionally, I'd notice the woman from a distance at the grocery store or walking the far side of the neighborhood. She never approached me again. Our paths didn't cross closely, but the change in her demeanor was unmistakable. The sharp confidence was gone, replaced by a careful distance. It wasn't fear I saw, but awareness. She had learned something expensive without a fine ever being written. Neighbors, on the other hand, grew friendlier. Some thanked me quietly for standing firm. Others shared their own stories about being intimidated or talked down to. I listened more than I spoke. Leadership isn't always about giving orders, sometimes it's about creating space for others to feel seen. If that confrontation had done anything good, it was that. One evening, as I parked in the same spot that had started everything, I thought about how close the situation had come to spiraling. A single accusation, delivered with confidence, nearly turned into something far worse. That's the danger of assumptions paired with authority. When people believe they can summon consequences without facts, everyone becomes vulnerable. I didn't regret choosing restraint. Power without control is just noise, and real authority doesn't need to shout. It waits, observes, and acts deliberately. That lesson had guided me through my career, and it had guided me that morning too. The outcome wasn't about humiliation or dominance. It was about restoring truth to a place where it had been replaced by entitlement. Looking back, I realize why the moment resonated so deeply. It wasn't the badge, the rank, or the police car. It was the sudden shift when reality arrived and stripped away false confidence. Watching someone confront the consequences of their own certainty is sobering, for them and for everyone else. The driveway never changed, but the neighborhood did. Boundaries became clearer, conversations more respectful, and complaints far rarer. Sometimes, the most lasting impact of a confrontation isn't the confrontation itself, but the silence afterward, the pause where people rethink how they treat others. That morning could have ended differently. It could have escalated, hardened, or turned bitter. Instead, it became a quiet lesson in accountability, one that followed everyone involved long after the flashing lights disappeared. And for me, it reinforced a simple truth I carry into every role I hold: authority is earned every day, not assumed in a moment of anger. If you'd like to revise, extend, or start a new story, let me know. And I'll write it immediately clean, powerful, and the story didn't end for me when the neighborhood went quiet. In fact, the quiet made the lesson louder. A few days after everything settled, I was back on base, sitting through a leadership seminar meant for newly promoted officers. As I listened to discussions about authority, discretion, and accountability, my mind kept drifting back to that driveway. It struck me how the same principles applied, whether you're commanding thousands or standing alone on your property. One slide on the screen read, "Power reveals character under pressure." I almost smiled. That morning, pressure had revealed more than anyone expected. It showed how easily someone can confuse confidence with correctness, and how quickly that illusion collapses when facts enter the room. It also forced me to examine myself. Authority gives you options. Character decides which one you take. Weeks later, I received a handwritten note in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a short apology. No excuses, no justifications, just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a sentence about learning to pause before reacting. I didn't know if it was written out of guilt, fear, or genuine reflection. But it mattered. Accountability doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it's private, uncomfortable, and real. I never responded. Some things don't require closure in conversation. The absence of retaliation was response enough. From that point on, the neighborhood felt balanced again, like a scale finally resting level. People waved. Kids played. Life moved forward, unchanged on the surface, but subtly improved underneath. The incident also changed how I addressed my own team. I began sharing the story not for humor or shock, but as a reminder. I told them how easily authority can be misused, and how restraint can be more powerful than enforcement. I emphasized that rank doesn't make you right, and calm doesn't make you weak. The story landed every time. Not because of who I was, but because of what the moment represented. Looking back, the most striking part wasn't her reaction or the officer's salute. It was the instant when truth arrived and everyone felt it. That moment where noise stops, assumptions collapse, and reality takes over. Those moments are rare, but when they come, they define people. That driveway still looks ordinary. Concrete, oil stains, tire marks. Nothing about it hints at what happened there. But for me, it's a marker. A reminder that authority is tested in small, unexpected ways. That leadership doesn't begin with commands, but with choices. And if there's one thing that morning taught me, it's this: you don't need to raise your voice, threaten consequences, or prove dominance. Sometimes, all you need to do is stand your ground, tell the truth, and let reality speak for itself. Months later, I was reminded how stories like this never truly belong to one moment. I was invited to speak at a community leadership workshop off base, a mixed audience of civilians, veterans, and local officials. The topic was conflict resolution. As I stood at the podium, scanning unfamiliar faces, I realized many of them had lived some version of that driveway morning, either as the accused or the accuser. I didn't name names or places. I told it plainly, stripping away drama and focusing on choices. I described how quickly assumptions escalate when certainty replaces curiosity. I explained how law enforcement becomes a tool instead of a safeguard when emotions drive decisions. The room stayed quiet, not out of boredom, but recognition. People lean in when they hear themselves in a story. Afterward, a woman approached me, hands clasped tightly. She told me she had once called the police on a neighbor during a dispute she later realized she misunderstood. No charges were filed, but the guilt lingered. Hearing my story, she said, helped her finally understand why that moment haunted her. Accountability doesn't always arrive with consequences, sometimes it arrives with clarity. That conversation stayed with me. It reinforced something I'd begun to believe strongly: power isn't just about what happens when authority shows up. It's about what happens after, when people sit alone with their decisions. That's where growth either begins or resentment hardens. Back home, the neighborhood continued its quiet rhythm. New families moved in. Old ones moved out. The driveway became just another part of the scenery. Yet every now and then, I'd catch someone pausing before reacting, choosing conversation over confrontation. I can't prove the connection, but I sensed it. Examples echo. The base commander title eventually rotated, as it always does. Rank changes. Responsibility passes. But the lesson followed me into every role afterward. Whether managing crises or mediating disagreements, I carried that morning with me as a reference point. Not as a victory, but as a reminder of restraint exercised at the right moment. What stays with me most isn't the shock on her face or the officer's reaction. It's the fragile space where decisions are made before authority enters. That space determines whether situations heal or fracture. Most people don't realize how much power they hold there. If there's a takeaway worth sharing, it's simple. Before reaching for escalation, pause. Before assuming intent, ask. Before calling for power, consider responsibility. Because once authority is summoned, the outcome rarely belongs to just one person anymore. That morning on my driveway proved something lasting. Calm can outlast outrage. Truth doesn't need volume. And sometimes, the strongest statement you can make is refusing to become what someone expects you to be. Time has a way of turning sharp moments into quiet markers, and by the following year, the driveway incident had become one of mine. Not something I spoke about often, but something I carried. I noticed it most when tensions ran high elsewhere during negotiations, disciplinary reviews, or disagreements where everyone believed they were right. In those moments, I remembered how easily certainty can harden into conflict. One afternoon, a junior officer came to me frustrated after a dispute with a civilian contractor. He wanted immediate action, firm consequences, and a show of authority. As he spoke, I recognized the same emotional momentum I'd seen on my driveway. I didn't shut him down. I asked him to slow the situation, gather facts, and consider the long view. He resisted at first, but he listened. Days later, he returned to thank me. The issue resolved without escalation, and the working relationship survived. That mattered more than winning. Leadership is full of moments like that, small crossroads where impulse and discipline diverge. Most people never see them, but they shape outcomes more than dramatic decisions ever do. The driveway taught me that those crossroads exist everywhere, even in places that feel ordinary. Especially there. I also learned how fragile trust can be once authority is misused. Even when no charges are filed and no records linger, the emotional residue remains. People remember how it felt to be accused, ignored, or overpowered. Repairing that damage takes far more effort than avoiding it in the first place. That understanding changed how I approached power permanently. Occasionally, someone would still ask about the story, usually second-hand and exaggerated. I corrected what needed correcting and left the rest alone. Stories grow teeth when they're fed. I preferred truth without embellishment. The real lesson didn't need drama to survive. What struck me most over time was how often people confuse being loud with being strong. The woman on the driveway believed volume would summon control. In reality, it exposed insecurity. Strength, I learned again, is quiet confidence backed by facts and patience. It doesn't rush. It doesn't threaten. It waits. As seasons changed, the neighborhood aged naturally. Trees grew taller. Sidewalk cracks spread. New routines replaced old tensions. No one mentioned the incident anymore, but its influence lingered in subtle ways: polite conversations, clearer boundaries, fewer assumptions. That's how real change usually looks, unannounced and uncelebrated. If I could speak to my past self standing there that morning, I wouldn't tell him to do anything differently. I'd just remind him why calm matters. Because every confrontation is an opportunity to either reinforce division or model something better. The driveway gave me that opportunity unexpectedly. I took it without realizing how far the ripple would travel. And even now, years later, that ripple still guides how I choose to stand my ground with firmness, restraint, and respect for the weight authority carries. Years later, I stood in that same driveway during a farewell gathering before another transfer. Boxes lined the garage, memories stacked invisibly alongside them. Neighbors stopped by with handshakes, baked goods, and casual goodbyes. As I thanked them, I realized how much that single morning had quietly shaped the place I was leaving behind. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. One neighbor pulled me aside and admitted something I hadn't expected. She said that before the incident, she'd often hesitated to speak up when HOA members overreached. After seeing how calmly the situation was handled, she felt more confident asserting herself respectfully. Others echoed similar thoughts in passing conversations. None of them mentioned rank or police cars. They talked about composure, about fairness, about not being afraid to question without hostility. That mattered more than any official outcome ever could. Leadership doesn't replicate itself through rules, it spreads through example. Watching someone refuse to escalate can be just as instructive as watching someone take command. Sometimes more so. The driveway had become a quiet reference point for how conflict could be resolved without damage. On my final night, I stood alone outside, listening to distant traffic and cicadas. I thought about how unpredictable influence can be. You don't choose the moments that define you. They choose you. All you control is how you respond when they arrive uninvited. That realization stayed with me as I moved on to new responsibilities, new environments, and new challenges. Wherever I went next, the lesson followed. When tempers flared, I slowed the pace. When accusations surfaced, I asked for facts. When power was demanded, I considered whether it was truly needed. Each time, the memory of that morning grounded me. It reminded me that authority works best when it's steady, not sharp. I never heard from the woman again. Our lives diverged completely, as most briefly intersecting paths do. I hope she found peace with what happened. I hope she learned, as I did, that certainty should always be tested before action. Growth often comes wrapped in discomfort, but it comes nonetheless. As I locked the front door for the last time, I glanced once more at the driveway. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Yet it carried a story that would stay with me long after the concrete cracked and was replaced. Not because of conflict, but because of restraint. Some lessons announce themselves loudly. Others whisper and linger. This one did both, at different times. And it taught me something enduring: the strongest leaders don't seek moments to assert power. They recognize moments to demonstrate control, patience, and respect, especially when no one expects it. By the time I settled into my next post, the driveway incident had become part of my mental toolkit, a reference for leadership under pressure. I realized it wasn't the only situation I'd face where someone misjudged me, or where authority could be challenged or weaponized, but it was one of the clearest examples of what happens when truth, patience, and calm collide with arrogance and assumption. Months into my new role, I found myself mentoring a group of junior officers. They were bright, ambitious, and sometimes impatient, eager to make their mark, eager to act before thinking. One evening, over coffee, a young officer asked me how I dealt with difficult civilians who challenged authority. I shared the story, careful not to focus on names or locations, but emphasizing the choices I had made. I explained that the goal isn't to humiliate or dominate, it's to resolve the situation while maintaining integrity and order. Their faces reflected both disbelief and curiosity. Leadership lessons often do. The driveway taught me something else: how quickly assumptions can cloud judgment. The woman who had called the police was certain she was right. She assumed I would react with anger, that my authority was irrelevant, and that the outcome was predetermined in her favor. It was the exact kind of thinking I warned my men's against. Authority doesn't guarantee obedience. Facts do. Patience does. Clarity does. I also learned that consequences aren't always immediate or visible. Sometimes, they ripple slowly through people's behavior, their choices, and even the culture of a place. Neighbors became more considerate. The HOA became more thoughtful. My officers became more reflective. All because a moment of clarity and restraint left a lasting impression. Small events, handled correctly, create larger patterns. Looking back, I realized the driveway incident wasn't about ego or rank. It was about testing the very foundation of how people perceive authority and accountability. When handled properly, it reinforced respect rather than fear. It reinforced understanding rather than chaos. It reinforced the principle that patience and preparation outweigh impulsive reactions, every single time. Even now, years later, if someone mentions the driveway incident, I smile quietly. It's a reminder that leadership is measured not by victories, but by composure. That authority isn't about power, it's about responsibility. And that, when faced with false certainty or misplaced outrage, the right choice is often the calmest one, standing firm while letting truth do its work. The driveway remains ordinary, yet it is etched in memory as the place where assumptions were corrected, lessons were learned, and quiet authority quietly spoke louder than any accusation ever could.